How much do you trust your psychologist? You trust them with your thoughts, your fears, your trauma, the parts of yourself you wouldn't show anyone else. But what if the person sitting across from you isn't safe? One of the central ideas in modern criminology can be reduced to a simple pattern. Violence most often occurs where there is an imbalance of power. And if you look closely at many of the cases I've covered on this channel, you start to notice the same pattern repeating itself again and again. It is violence directed at those who are more vulnerable: children, women, the elderly, those who are physically or socially weaker. While cases in which the victim and the perpetrator are truly equal in power remain rare. Statistics only reinforce this pattern, leaving very little room for doubt. The overwhelming majority of violent offenders are men, and the vast majority of victims of sexual violence are women, while the remaining percentage includes not only adult men, but also young boys, who are, by definition, part of a vulnerable group. Age itself plays a significant role, as children are consistently exposed to different forms of violence from adults, and according to international research, a substantial number of individuals experience abuse early in life, often before the age of 25. What many studies continue to confirm is that violence tends to emerge in environments where there is social authority, physical or financial inequality, or a clear hierarchy. Any structure that places one person in a position of control over another. That is why it becomes especially important to pay attention to institutions where these dynamics are built into the relationship itself, and medicine is one of them. Because no matter how it appears from the outside, the patient is always in a weaker position than the doctor. We tend to believe that medical professionals are carefully vetted and that the system is designed to protect those who seek help. But in reality, that level of scrutiny is not always as thorough as we would like to think. Hi, I'm glad you're here. On this channel, I tell true crime stories that explore not only what happened, but why it happened. So make yourself a cup of tea, and let's take a closer look at today's case. This is a story about a young man who, under the influence of his psychiatrist, a woman who repeatedly crossed professional boundaries, was drawn into something far darker than treatment. On November 12th, 2012, a 20-year-old named Jacob Nolan entered the office of psychiatrist Michael Weiss, and security footage from the reception area shows him holding a sheet of paper, which would later be identified as a hand-drawn map, a simple layout showing how to reach his target. Over his shoulder hung a bag containing everything he had brought with him: a kitchen knife and a heavy hammer, the kind of object chosen with a very specific intention. The man he came for was not a stranger, but someone he had known since childhood and deeply respected, which makes the question unavoidable. What could have driven him to this point? To understand that, we need to go back. Jacob Nolan grew up in a wealthy family as the youngest of 3 children, and those who knew him described him as gentle, sensitive, and incapable of harming anyone, while at the same time recognizing that he was an exceptionally bright By the time Jacob entered college, doctors had already tried nearly 30 different prescription medications, at times prescribing 5 or 6 at once, yet none of it seemed to bring stability, and in some ways it may have made things worse, as the depression, anxiety, and mood instability never truly disappeared. Eventually, he began to cope through alcohol and drugs, and classmates later recalled that he often struggled even to function day to day, sometimes barely able to stay on his feet. His parents were desperate, continuing to search for any solution that might help their son, and then what initially felt like an answer appeared. Jacob's cousin, Pamela Buchbinder, a qualified psychiatrist, offered to take over his treatment, and because she'd been close to the family for years, someone Jacob had known since childhood, she was trusted completely. Her plan seemed structured and reassuring. Jacob would spend part of his time living in her Manhattan apartment, where she would personally oversee his therapy and medication, and in return, he would help care for her 4-year-old son, Calder. On paper, it already raised serious ethical concerns, but in practice, it crossed nearly every professional boundary, and yet, at first, it appeared to work. Jacob became noticeably happier, more engaged, more present, creating the impression that he was finally improving. But much later, his parents would say that sending him to live with Pamela was the worst decision they had ever made. Because what they didn't realize at the time was that their son had become part of something else entirely, a personal conflict between 2 psychiatrists. Earlier, there was a video from Jacob's bar mitzvah, where Pamela was seen dancing with her boyfriend, and that man was Michael Weiss, the same man Jacob would attack 7 years later. To understand how someone like Jacob Nolan, quiet, fragile, and by all accounts harmless, ended up walking into an office carrying a knife and a hammer, you have to look closely at the period when he began living with the person who would come to occupy a central place in his life, his cousin, Pamela Buchbinder. Jacob moved in with Pamela after her final separation from Michael Weiss, and despite the fact that she was not only his relative, but also significantly older than him, the true nature of their relationship remains unclear. There were a number of questionable elements that, in retrospect, suggest something far more complex than a standard doctor-patient dynamic, possibly even something with emotional or romantic undertones. But that becomes relevant a little later. What is known for certain is that Jacob, at 20 years old, spent most of his time with Pamela. He lived in her apartment, helped care for her young son, and gradually became integrated into her daily life to such an extent that she and her child began to feel like his new family. At the same time, another presence started to emerge more and more frequently in conversation. A man whose name Jacob kept hearing, Michael Weiss. And the more often that name came up, the more his perception of that man began to shift. Very little is known in detail about Pamela and Michael's relationship, but those who knew them described it as deeply toxic, marked by repeated breakups and reconciliations, as well as mutual accusations of domestic abuse. There were multiple reports to the police, and at one point, both of them were arrested following a violent incident in which Pamela allegedly attacked Michael, throwing broken glass at him and causing injuries that required stitches, while she, in turn, told police that he had threatened and attempted to harm her. Eventually, the charges against both of them were dropped. They never married, and their relationship finally ended not long after the birth of their son, Calder. However, the conflict between them did not disappear. It simply moved into the legal system, where they spent years fighting over custody. Calder lived with Pamela, and she strongly opposed Michael having any contact with the child, repeatedly accusing him of abuse. No evidence was ever found to support these claims, and according to expert evaluations, these accusations were likely fabricated in an attempt to prevent Michael from seeing his son. This legal battle went on for years. When Calder was 4, Pamela asked Jacob to become the child's godfather, a decision that came shortly before she invited him to move in. Over time, Jacob became deeply attached to the boy, and while Renshaw his focus had been on his own struggles, his attention gradually shifted toward Calder's well-being. He knew the child looked up to him, and they spent most of their time together. From an outside perspective, the situation was highly inappropriate. A psychiatrist and a patient are not supposed to share a living space, build a family-like dynamic, or develop emotional dependency. But in Jacob's case, that boundary was not just blurred, it was erased. At some point, his attachment to Pamela deepened into something stronger. He later said more than once that he would be willing to do anything for her and for her son. At the same time, Pamela, Jacob, and even his family consistently denied that there had been any romantic or sexual relationship between them. Instead, what many would later suggest is that this was a case of psychological manipulation, the gradual shaping of a vulnerable mind through a carefully constructed narrative. Within that narrative, Pamela positioned herself as a protective mother and Michael as a dangerous threat. According to Jacob, she spoke about Michael constantly, describing him as abusive, neglectful, and dangerous, claiming that he was harming their son, physically, emotionally, and sexually. In the months leading up to the attack, these statements became more frequent, more intense, and more specific, until the idea itself began to take hold. Repeated often enough, it stopped sounding like an accusation and started to feel like a fact. Step by step, Jacob was drawn deeper into her version of reality, until, if his later testimony is to be believed, he became part of something far more deliberate. He would eventually claim that Pamela had a plan, and that the plan went far beyond simply harming Michael. According to Jacob, she wanted him to make Michael suffer before killing him. The day before the attack, Pamela went with Jacob to a Home Depot store, where they purchased a hammer and a pack of plastic zip ties. Surveillance footage from the checkout later confirmed that Jacob stood slightly aside while Pamela paid for the items, including the very hammer that police would find the next morning on the floor of Michael Weiss's office. According to the plan she had outlined, the zip ties were meant to restrain the victim, and the knife was intended for something far more deliberate, something Jacob ultimately refused to carry out. He agreed to kill, but not to prolong suffering. On the morning of November 12th, the day the attack was supposed to happen, Jacob did not wake up alone. He later claimed that Pamela was there beside him, speaking softly, telling him that she loved him, that he was her savior, that he was the only person who truly understood her. At the same time, she was the one placing the hammer and the kitchen knife into his bag, moving between affection and visible distress, which Jacob would later describe as a kind of emotional breakdown. Before he left, she handed him a handwritten map, a detailed layout of the building where Michael Weiss's office was located, including multiple entry points that could be used to bypass standard security routes. According to Weiss's legal team, the purpose of the map was clear: to ensure that Jacob could reach his target without being stopped. When everything was ready, Pamela walked him to the door and said, "This is the day. Everything will be better once Michael is gone." Holding the map in his hands, Jacob made his way to a high-rise building in Manhattan. He approached it from different sides, as if trying to understand the layout in real time, before eventually entering through a service entrance. At the reception desk, he signed in under his real name, stating that he was heading to a tutoring center called Bright Kids, a location that had been specifically marked on the map. Later, he would explain this decision in simple terms. He wasn't trying to hide. "I signed in with my real name. I was ready to die for her. I wasn't trying to cover anything up." He went up to the 12th floor and found Michael Weiss in the middle of a session with a patient. Instead of interrupting, Jacob stepped back into the hallway and waited on the stairwell until the meeting was over. In those minutes, he later said, doubt began to creep in. The idea of walking away, of abandoning the plan, crossed his mind more than once, and for a brief moment he seriously considered leaving. But that option, in his mind, no longer existed. He felt that going back without doing what he had come to do was not possible. When the patient finally left, Jacob entered the office and asked Weiss for financial documents related to Calder's school, a request that, according to Pamela's version, was the reason for his visit. But Jacob later admitted that this was only a distraction, a way to buy a few minutes. While Weiss was searching for the papers, Jacob stepped out, went to the restroom, and prepared himself. He took the hammer out of his bag, placed the knife in his pocket, and after a short pause, returned. The attack happened almost immediately. Jacob lunged at Weiss with the hammer, but at the last second, Weiss managed to move, and the blow did not land where it was intended. Instead, it struck his shoulder. In the next moment, Jacob reached for the knife, and what followed turned into a violent struggle. Despite being injured, Weiss was physically stronger, and as the fight escalated, he managed to resist, eventually gaining control. Both men were seriously wounded as the confrontation spilled out of the office and into the hallway, where the noise drew attention from others in the building. Neighbors usłyszeli kriki I zvuki borby and called the police. Gradually, the struggle lost intensity. At some point, both men, exhausted and bleeding, ended up sitting on the floor in the corridor, facing each other, waiting for help to arrive. And then something happened that no one could have expected. Sitting there, covered in blood, Jacob took out his phone and took a selfie. What happened next only made the situation more unsettling. A man who had just attempted to take someone's life did not try to escape, did not attempt to finish what he had started, but instead calmly took out his phone and photographed himself, covered in blood, moments after the fight. He sent the image to Pamela. It was a signal, a demonstration of what he had done, and at the same time, an ojidanie dalniejszych instructions. There was no reply. Later, already in the hospital, Jacob tried to reach her again. He sent another message, telling her where he was, asking her to come, describing the condition they were both in, that Michael was bleeding heavily, that he was injured as well. This time she responded. Just one word, short, detached, and, judging by Jacob's later statements, offering no guidance, no plan, no continuation of what had been set in motion. In fact, as he would later describe it, there may never have been a clear plan for what was supposed to happen after the attack. At some point, He began to believe that Pamela intended to distance herself entirely, to treat the outcome as a failed attempt and simply move on, as if it could all be repeated later. Michael Weiss, despite multiple injuries to his upper body and legs, recovered relatively quickly after receiving medical treatment, and his condition was soon stable as Irvino. Jacob's recovery was far more complicated. In addition to his physical injuries, doctors documented severe psychological disturbance and, according to hospital records, he was experiencing a manic state, accompanied by a full psychotic episode. When the case eventually reached court, Jacob Nolan was released on bail set at $200,000 and allowed to stay with his parents while awaiting trial. And what about Pamela Buchbinder? Shortly after the attack, Michael filed for full custody of their son, claiming that Pamela had been involved in organizing the Napadania. The family court reviewed the available evidence, including footage from the store where the tools had been purchased, and ultimately ruled in his favor. Michael was granted full custody, and Pamela was prohibited from having any contact with Calder for 5 years. In its decision, the court noted that the materials presented suggested her possible involvement in planning or facilitating the attack. However, despite this conclusion, no criminal charges were brought against her at that time. Why that happened remains unclear, though later that would change. Meanwhile, Jacob's life continued to deteriorate. Back with his parents, he moved in and out of rehabilitation centers, struggling with substance abuse that not only returned but intensified. In 2015, he nearly died from an overdose after ingesting a large amount of different substances, an event that left him in a coma due to severe poisoning. The trial itself did not take place until several years after the attack, and even then, Jacob's participation was significantly limited. The court eventually restricted his testimony, considering it unreliable due to the constant changes in his version of events. In the days following the attack, he claimed that he had acted under Pamela's influence and that she had manipulated him. Yet, at the scene, when police arrived, he pointed to Weiss and said that the doctor had attacked him first. At that time, he made no mention of the hammer he himself had brought. Later still, he offered another version, suggesting that Weiss had taken the hammer from his bag and initiated the attack. Given these inconsistencies, the court treated his statements with caution. According to the official conclusion, Jacob's motive was rooted in his belief that he was protecting Pamela and her son from a man he had come to see as dangerous and abusive. Prosecutors, however, pointed to a different and potentially more compelling motive. Shortly before the attack, Michael Weiss had taken out a life insurance policy worth $1.5 million, naming his son Calder as the beneficiary. Just 3 days before the incident, he agreed to designate Pamela as the irrevocable trustee of that policy, meaning that, in the event of his death, she would have control over those funds until the child reached adulthood. Formally, her role would have been to manage the money in the child's best interest. In practice, it created a powerful financial incentive. As it later became clear, Jacob had no knowledge of this detail at the time of the attack. Pamela had never told him about the policy or her role in it. Another central question in court was Jacob's mental state. He himself insisted that he understood his actions and was in control, and certain elements of his communication seemed to support that claim. For example, during discussions leading up to the attack, when Pamela allegedly encouraged him to inflict prolonged suffering on her former partner, Jacob refused. It was one of the few lines he did not cross. Jacob agreed to kill, but he refused to inflict prolonged suffering. That detail became central in the debate over his mental state. On one hand, it suggested that he was capable of making independent decisions and drawing moral boundaries for himself. On the other, the defense argued that his actions still reflected a powerful psychological influence that shaped his behavior at a deeper level. One of Jacob's attorneys stated that his client was unable to provide a coherent explanation for his motives, and according to the defense, this inability pointed to serious psychiatric disturbance that should have reduced his criminal responsibility. A forensic psychiatrist partially supported that argument. In her evaluation, she concluded that Pamela Buchbinder had, in effect, overridden Jacob's autonomy with her own influence, comparing the dynamic to a cult, a closed system in which one person gradually reshapes another's thinking to align with their own beliefs. Except in this case, the cult consisted of only two people, Pamela as the leader and Jacob as the sole follower. Jacob did not testify in court, and Pamela did not appear during his trial. In March 2016, after 2 weeks of hearings, the jury deliberated for less than an hour before delivering a clear verdict. Jacob Nolan was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 9 years in prison. A little over a year later, in October 2017, the legal process reached Pamela as well. Michael Weiss continued a separate case against her, and eventually, formal charges were brought. She was accused of attempted murder in the second degree, attempted assault in the first degree, and conspiracy, specifically orchestrating a plan to have Jacob Nolan attack and kill her former partner, the father of her child. This position aligned with what prosecutors had suggested from the beginning, that Pamela had been the driving force behind the crime. The judge denied her bail, and she was held at Rikers Island, where she remained for several years as the case moved slowly through the system, further delayed by the pandemic. Then, on September 7th, 2022, during a pre-trial hearing, the case took an unexpected turn. Pamela agreed to a plea deal. Under its terms, she admitted guilt to attempted assault, and in exchange, prosecutors agreed to recommend a sentence of 11 years. At that point, it seemed the case was nearing its conclusion, but within a month, she reversed her decision. Her lawyer zaявili, that she wanted to withdraw her plea, claiming that she had been in an impaired state at the time, exposed to tear gas, deprived of necessary medication, and affected by substances she had allegedly inhaled during transport. The court rejected these arguments. The plea agreement remained in place. Michael Weiss appeared in court to deliver a victim impact statement, describing the lasting psychological consequences of the attack, including post-traumatic stress, and expressing his belief that Pamela's hostility toward him remained so strong that it could persist even after her release. The judge, who had also presided over Jacob's case, noted that the evidence presented was consistent with much of Jacob's earlier account, including the pattern of influence and manipulation. Prosecutors also emphasized the financial dimension of the case. Shortly before the attack, Weiss had secured a life insurance policy worth $1.5 million, naming his son as the beneficiary, while assigning Pamela control over the funds as trustee in the event of his death. Formally, this role required her to manage the money in the child's best interest. In reality, it created stated a clear financial motive. Ultimately, Pamela Buchbinder was sentenced to 11 years in prison, along with a protective order prohibiting any contact with Michael Weiss. If she complies with prison regulations, she may become eligible for early release around 2027. By that point, the central conclusion of the case had become difficult to ignore. Pamela Buchbinder, a licensed psychiatrist, had systematically influenced a young man who was, at the same time, her relative, her patient, and someone under her care, gradually turning him into an instrument for carrying out her own intentions. What makes this case especially disturbing is not only the level of personal hostility involved, but the fact that it came from someone whose profession was built on trust, care, and responsibility toward vulnerable individuals. So the question becomes unavoidable. Who do you trust with your mental health? In one national survey of psychiatrists in the United States, approximately 7% of male psychiatrists and 3% of female psychiatrists admitted to having had sexual contact with patients, with the majority of such cases involving male doctors and female patients. The issue of professional boundaries remains very real, and the people who seek help are often those least able to protect themselves. Thank you for watching. If you choose to stay, I'll see you in the next story.